The morning mist hung heavy over the ancient cobblestones of Buckingham Palace as General Viktor Kozlov stepped out of his black sedan. The Russian military attaché adjusted his uniform, heavy with medals and ribbons that spoke of decades spent commanding respect across Eastern Europe. At 52, he carried himself with the rigid posture of a man who had never been denied, never been questioned, and certainly never been humbled by anyone in a ceremonial costume. Kozlov's pale blue eyes swept across the palace courtyard with barely concealed disdain. Everything about this place seemed like theater to him, from the ornate gates to the tourists snapping photographs behind velvet ropes. He had come to London for what his superiors called a diplomatic courtesy visit, though both sides understood it was more about posturing than genuine diplomacy. The general had spent the previous evening at embassy functions, listening to British officials speak of tradition and honor while he mentally catalogued their military weaknesses. As he approached the main entrance, Kozlov noticed the Queen's Guard standing at their posts. Two young men, barely out of their teens by his estimation, stood motionless in their distinctive red tunics and tall black bearskin hats. Their rifles remained fixed at their shoulders, their eyes staring straight ahead with mechanical precision. The general's lips curved into a cold smile. These were not soldiers in his mind, but actors playing dress-up for the entertainment of crowds. The general paused deliberately in front of the nearest guardsman, studying him like a specimen in a laboratory. Private James Mitchell, though Kozlov did not know his name, had been standing at his post since dawn. At 19 years old, Mitchell had already completed 2 tours of duty in Afghanistan, where he had earned commendations for bravery under fire. His calm exterior masked years of training and real combat experience, but to the foreign general, he appeared to be nothing more than a statue in an elaborate costume. Kozlov leaned closer to Mitchell, speaking in heavily accented English loud enough for nearby tourists to hear. "So this is what the mighty British Army has become, pretty boys in fancy hats standing still for pictures." He chuckled, a harsh sound that carried across the courtyard. "In my country, soldiers fight wars, not pose for postcards." The guardsman's face remained expressionless, his breathing steady and controlled. Years of training had prepared him for exactly this type of provocation. The Queen's Guard were taught to remain professional regardless of insults, threats, or attempts to break their concentration. Mitchell had faced far worse than verbal abuse during his service, but something about the general's contemptuous tone stirred a deep anger that he carefully suppressed. Emboldened by the lack of response, Kozlov stepped even closer. He could smell the young soldier's cologne mixed with the leather of his uniform. "Tell me, boy," the general whispered, his breath visible in the cool morning air, "have you ever seen real combat? Have you ever held a dying man in your arms while bullets whistled over your head? Or do you just march around in parades like a trained monkey?" The question hit closer to home than Kozlov could have imagined. Mitchell's mind flashed briefly to memories of dusty Afghan villages, the weight of fallen comrades, the split-second decisions that meant life or death. But his training held firm. His eyes remained fixed on the distant horizon, his posture unchanged. To observers, he appeared completely unaffected by the general's words. Several tourists had stopped to watch the exchange, some looking uncomfortable at the foreign officer's aggressive behavior. A few British officials who were escorting Kozlov shifted nervously, clearly wanting to intervene, but uncertain how to do so without causing a diplomatic incident. The general, however, interpreted the silence as weakness and pressed his advantage. "Look at this," Kozlov announced to the growing crowd, gesturing dramatically at Mitchell. "This is what happens when a military becomes soft, when tradition matters more than strength. These guards are museum pieces, relics of an empire that no longer exists." He reached out as if to touch the guardsman's rifle, stopping just short of actual contact. In my army, soldiers would have already responded to such disrespect, but these British toy soldiers are trained only to stand and be pretty. The insult to his regiment, to his country, and to his fallen brothers in arms burned in Mitchell's chest like acid. Every fiber of his being wanted to respond, to show this arrogant foreign officer exactly what kind of soldier he was dealing with. But discipline held him in place like iron chains. He had sworn an oath to protect the crown and maintain the dignity of his position, regardless of personal cost. Kozlov's confidence grew with each passing moment of silence. He began to pace back and forth in front of the guard post, his voice rising as he warmed to his theme. "This is the difference between our nations," he declared. "Russia produces warriors, Britain produces performers. You dress them up in costumes from centuries past and pretend they represent military might, but they are nothing more than actors on a stage." What the general did not understand, could not comprehend in his arrogance, was that he was not facing a mere ceremonial guard. Private Mitchell represented something far more dangerous than Kozlov's crude understanding of military strength. He embodied the quiet professionalism of soldiers who had learned that true power came not from boasting or displays of aggression, but from discipline, training, and the ability to act with devastating effectiveness when the situation truly demanded it. The mourning crowd continued to grow as word spread of the confrontation. Some visitors looked on with fascination, others with growing discomfort at the foreign officer's behavior. British security personnel stationed around the palace began to take notice, speaking quietly into their communication devices and positioning themselves closer to the scene. They recognized the potential for escalation and prepared to intervene if necessary. Kozlov, drunk on his own perceived dominance, failed to notice the subtle changes in the atmosphere around him. He had become so focused on humiliating what he saw as a helpless target that he missed the signs of gathering storm clouds on his horizon. The general's cultural blindness prevented him from recognizing that he was not dealing with weakness, but with a strength so controlled and disciplined that it appeared deceptively calm on the surface. As the confrontation stretched into its second hour, Mitchell's fellow guards remained equally motionless at their posts, but seasoned observers could detect the almost imperceptible tension that had settled over the entire courtyard. These were not ordinary young men playing soldier. They were veterans of real conflicts, trained to a level of proficiency that the general's assumptions could not account for. Each of them had earned their position through demonstrated courage and skill that went far beyond ceremonial duties. The general's mistake was assuming that discipline equaled weakness, that professionalism indicated a lack of fighting spirit. He had confused the ability to remain controlled under pressure with an inability to respond when action was required. It was an error in judgment that would soon cost him more than he could imagine, though at this moment, basking in what he believed was his superiority over these silent British soldiers, General Viktor Kozlov felt nothing but satisfaction at his successful demonstration of Russian military superiority. The afternoon sun climbed higher, casting shorter shadows across the palace courtyard as General Kozlov's verbal assault continued. What had begun as casual mockery had evolved into something more systematic and cruel. The Russian officer seemed to draw energy from what he perceived as his complete dominance over the silent British guards, and his behavior grew increasingly reckless with each passing hour. By now, a substantial crowd had gathered to witness the spectacle. Tourism officials whispered urgently into their phones, trying to determine how to handle a situation that was rapidly becoming an international embarrassment. The general's own diplomatic escort looked increasingly uncomfortable, but protocol prevented them from directly contradicting a senior military officer from an allied nation, even one behaving so inappropriately. Kozlov had moved beyond simple insults and had begun attempting to physically provoke the guardsman. He made sudden movements near their faces, clapped his hands loudly next to their ears, and even went so far as to drop his ceremonial gloves directly in front of Private Mitchell's polished boots. Each action was designed to force a reaction, to prove his theory that these soldiers were nothing more than well-dressed mannequins. "Perhaps they are deaf as well as useless," the general announced loudly to the crowd, some of whom were now openly expressing disapproval of his behavior. "In Russia, we would never tolerate such weakness from our military. A soldier who cannot even acknowledge an insult is no soldier at all." He turned to face Mitchell directly, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "I wonder what your dead comrades would think of you now, standing here like a painted doll while a real soldier mocks everything you claim to represent." The words struck deep, but Mitchell's training held firm. His mind had long since retreated to the mental fortress that all professional soldiers learn to construct. He thought of his oath, of the honor of his regiment, of the centuries of guardsmen who had stood at these same posts through wars and peace, never breaking their discipline regardless of provocation. The weight of that history anchored him against the storm of the general's abuse. What Kozlov did not realize was that his behavior was being carefully documented by multiple sources. Palace security cameras captured every word and gesture. Several tourists were recording the incident on their phones, and social media posts were already beginning to spread across the internet. More importantly, senior British military officials had been notified of the situation and were monitoring it closely from their offices nearby. Colonel Sarah Pemberton, commanding officer of the Guards Regiment, watched the live security feed with growing anger. A veteran of 3 combat deployments herself, she knew exactly what caliber of soldiers were standing at those posts. Private Mitchell alone had saved 6 lives during an insurgent attack in Helmand Province, earning him a commendation for valor that he wore with quiet pride. To see such a man subjected to this humiliation while maintaining perfect discipline only increased her respect for his professionalism. The colonel reached for her secure phone and placed a call to the Russian embassy. Her voice was calm and measured, but those who knew her recognized the dangerous undertone that appeared when her patience reached its limits. "This is Colonel Pemberton. I believe you have one of your officers conducting himself inappropriately on palace grounds. I suggest you might want to retrieve him before this situation develops further." Meanwhile, General Kozlov had begun to involve the crowd in his performance, encouraging tourists to take photographs with what he called Britain's toy soldiers. He posed dramatically next to the guardsman, making exaggerated expressions of superiority while urging others to join him in mocking the silent figures. Several visitors declined, clearly uncomfortable with the situation, but others were swept up in the spectacle. "Come, come," the general called out to a group of teenagers with cameras. "Stand here next to these statues. They will not move, will not speak, will not even blink if you wave in their faces. See how the mighty British Empire has fallen to this level of pathetic display." He gestured grandly at Mitchell and his fellow guards. "These are the inheritors of the army that once conquered half the world. Now they cannot even defend themselves from a few words." The teenagers looked uncertain, glancing between the general's encouraging gestures and the growing disapproval of other tourists. One of them, a young woman with bright purple hair, spoke up hesitantly. "Maybe we shouldn't bother them while they're working," she suggested. Kozlov laughed harshly. "Working? What work are they doing? They are decorations, nothing more. Human furniture placed here for the amusement of visitors like yourself. There is no dignity in their silence, only weakness." He moved closer to Mitchell again, his voice rising with excitement. "Watch this. I will prove to you that these are not real soldiers." The general reached into his jacket and withdrew a small ceremonial dagger, part of his dress uniform. The blade was barely 4 inches long and clearly designed for decoration rather than combat. But several security personnel immediately tensed as they spotted the weapon. Kozlov held it up dramatically, making sure the crowd could see the polished steel gleaming in the sunlight. "A real soldier would react to a weapon being drawn," he announced, pointing the blade toward Mitchell's chest without quite touching him. "But these pretty boys in their fancy costumes will not even acknowledge a threat. They are trained to be victims, not warriors." He moved the dagger slowly through the air, tracing patterns near the guardsman's face while maintaining a running commentary about British military decline. This crossed a line that even the most patient observers could not ignore. Several tourists began to back away, recognizing that the situation had moved beyond mere rudeness into something potentially dangerous. Palace security guards started moving closer, though they were constrained by diplomatic protocols that prevented them from immediately arresting a foreign military officer. Private Mitchell felt the change in temperature around him as the general's behavior escalated. His combat instincts, honed by years of real warfare, automatically assessed the threat level and began calculating response options. The small blade posed no serious danger to someone with his training, but its presence transformed the situation from harassment into a potential assault. Still, his discipline held. The Queen's Guard did not break formation for threats, only for genuine emergencies. What neither the general nor the crowd fully understood was that Mitchell and his fellow guards were not helpless. Their apparent vulnerability was an illusion created by their commitment to protocol and their confidence in the security systems that surrounded them. Each guardsman was a trained combat veteran, capable of disarming an opponent and neutralizing threats with swift efficiency. They remained motionless, not because they could not act, but because they chose not to act unless truly necessary. The irony was lost on General Kozlov, who interpreted their continued stillness as proof of his theories about British military weakness. He had no idea that he was surrounded by some of the most highly trained soldiers in the world, men who had faced down armed insurgents in actual combat zones and emerged victorious. His cultural blindness prevented him from recognizing that true strength often appeared in forms very different from his own crude displays of aggression. As the afternoon wore on, the general's performance grew more elaborate, and his demands for attention more desperate. He seemed to sense that his audience was growing uncomfortable with his behavior, but instead of moderating his approach, he doubled down on his aggression. The dagger remained in his hand as he circled the guardsman like a predator, his voice growing louder and his gestures more theatrical with each passing minute. Unknown to the general, senior British officials were already planning their response to his misconduct. Phone calls were being made to the highest levels of government, and diplomatic channels were heating up with carefully worded but unmistakably firm protests. The incident was rapidly escalating beyond a simple case of bad manners into a matter of international relations, and General Kozlov's name was being entered into files that would follow him for the rest of his career. But for now, the Russian officer remained blissfully unaware of the gathering storm. Intoxicated by what he believed was his complete dominance over the silent guards, he prepared to push his luck even further, never imagining that his next actions would trigger consequences that would haunt him for years to come. The late afternoon shadows were growing longer when General Kozlov made his fatal mistake. Emboldened by hours of perceived immunity from consequences, he decided to escalate his performance to what he believed would be its triumphant climax. The crowd had grown restless, many tourists expressing open disapproval of his behavior, but the general interpreted their discomfort as evidence that his demonstration was achieving its intended effect. "You see how they cower behind their silence," Kozlov declared, his voice echoing off the palace walls. "This is what happens to a military that prioritizes appearance over substance. They create soldiers who look impressive but crumble at the first sign of real pressure." He gestured with his ceremonial dagger, the blade catching the afternoon light. "In my country, such weakness would be eliminated during the first week of training. What happened next would be replayed on news broadcasts around the world and studied in diplomatic crisis management courses for years to come." The general, drunk on his own perceived power and desperate to prove his point to an increasingly hostile audience, made a decision that revealed just how completely he had misunderstood the situation he had created. With theatrical flourish, Kozlov reached out and deliberately knocked Private Mitchell's ceremonial bearskin hat from his head. The heavy headpiece tumbled to the cobblestones with a dull thud that seemed to echo through the suddenly silent courtyard. For the first time in over 4 hours, the guardsman was forced to break his perfect stillness. The reaction was swift and devastating in its controlled precision. Mitchell's training took over instantly, his body moving with the fluid efficiency of a combat veteran responding to assault. In one smooth motion, he stepped forward, grasped the general's wrist containing the dagger, and applied a precise pressure point technique that caused the weapon to drop harmlessly to the ground. The entire sequence lasted less than 3 seconds. "Sir, you have interfered with a Queen's Guard in the performance of his duties," Mitchell stated in a calm, clear voice that carried across the courtyard. "Please step back immediately." His tone was perfectly professional, but there was an unmistakable authority in his words that made several nearby tourists take involuntary steps backward. General Kozlov found himself frozen in place, his wrist still held in the guardsman's iron grip. The young man's face remained expressionless, but there was something in his eyes that the general had not expected to see. This was not the look of a ceremonial soldier or a palace decoration. These were the eyes of someone who had seen real combat, who had made life-and-death decisions under fire, who possessed a quiet confidence born of proven capability under the most extreme circumstances. "Release me immediately," the general sputtered, his voice cracking slightly as he tried to reassert his authority. "I am a diplomatic guest of your government. You have no right to lay hands on me." But even as he spoke the words, Kozlov could feel his confidence draining away like water through a broken dam. Mitchell maintained his grip for exactly 3 more seconds, long enough to ensure the general understood the situation had fundamentally changed, then released him with the same controlled precision he had used to capture him. "Sir, I must ask you to retrieve your hat and step away from the guard post," he said, his voice never rising above conversational level. "Any further interference will result in your immediate detention by palace security." The courtyard had fallen completely silent except for the clicking of camera shutters and the soft whir of video recordings. Tourists who had been uncomfortable with the general's behavior now watched with fascination as the power dynamic shifted completely. The Russian officer, who had spent hours demonstrating what he believed was his superiority over these silent soldiers, now faced the reality that he had been entirely wrong about everything. But the most devastating blow to the general's ego was yet to come. As he bent to retrieve his ceremonial dagger from the cobblestones, Private Mitchell spoke again, and this time his words carried the weight of personal knowledge that cut deeper than any physical action could have. "General Kozlov," the guardsman said quietly, "I served 2 tours in Afghanistan with the parachute regiment before transferring to the Guards. During that time, I had the privilege of working alongside members of the 45th Guards Spetsnaz Regiment during joint operations in Helmand Province." He paused, allowing the implications to sink in. "I believe you commanded that unit from 2018 to 2020? The general's face went pale. His ceremonial dagger slipped from his fingers again as the full magnitude of his error became clear. Private Mitchell was not just any guardsman. He was a combat veteran who had not only served in the same theater of operations as Kozlov's own elite troops, but had worked directly with them. More importantly, he would have access to after-action reports, casualty statistics, and performance evaluations that painted a very different picture than the one the general liked to present to his superiors. "Your Spetsnaz soldiers spoke very highly of British professionalism during those joint operations," Mitchell continued, his voice carrying a subtle emphasis that made it clear he was choosing his words carefully. They particularly appreciated our discipline under fire and our ability to maintain operational security even under extreme stress. I hope their training has continued to meet your high standards since then." The implications hung in the air like a sword over the general's head. Mitchell was politely indicating that he knew things about the general's command that could potentially embarrass him if they became public knowledge. The guardsman was not making threats, but he was making it clear that the general's attempts at humiliation had been directed at someone who possessed the capability to respond in kind if pushed too far. General Kozlov straightened slowly, his mind racing as he tried to process this new information. The young man standing before him was not the helpless target he had imagined, but a professional soldier who had earned his position through combat performance and who maintained connections throughout the international military community. Every word the general had spoken, every insult he had delivered, had been heard by someone who was perfectly positioned to judge their accuracy and respond accordingly. The crowd began to murmur as people processed what they had witnessed. The seemingly one-sided confrontation had revealed itself to be something very different. Social media posts that had begun as documentation of foreign arrogance toward British ceremony were rapidly being updated with new context about the professional backgrounds of the soldiers involved. Colonel Pemberton, who had been monitoring the situation remotely, chose this moment to make her appearance. She emerged from the palace with measured steps, her dress uniform immaculate, and her bearing radiating the quiet authority of an officer who had earned respect through decades of service. Behind her walked two diplomatic protocol officers and a senior representative from the Russian embassy who looked as though he wished he could be anywhere else in the world. "General Kozlov," the colonel said as she approached, her voice carrying across the courtyard with perfect clarity. "I believe you have met Private Mitchell, one of our finest guardsmen. I trust your visit to our palace has been educational." There was no hostility in her tone, but there was also no warmth. This was the voice of a professional addressing a colleague who had seriously overstepped boundaries. The general found himself caught between multiple, impossible choices. He could continue his aggressive behavior and risk further escalation with someone who clearly outranked him in this environment. He could attempt to apologize and admit that his entire performance had been based on ignorance and prejudice. Or he could try to withdraw with whatever dignity remained to him and hope that the incident would not follow him back to Moscow. As he stood there, surrounded by the evidence of his miscalculation, General Kozlov began to realize that his troubles were just beginning. The young guardsman, who had seemed so helpless, was calmly retrieving his bearskin hat and preparing to resume his post as though nothing unusual had happened. But everything had changed, and the general was starting to understand that the consequences of his afternoon's entertainment were likely to be far more serious than he had ever imagined. The silence stretched on as the general struggled to find words that might salvage something from the wreckage of his pride, while around him the world recorded every moment of his humiliation for posterity. The morning that followed would forever be etched in General Viktor Kozlov's memory as the beginning of his professional downfall. He awoke in his embassy quarters to the sound of his aide frantically knocking on his door, tablet in hand, face pale with concern. The digital age had worked its merciless magic overnight, and the general's humiliation at Buckingham Palace had become a global phenomenon. "Sir, you need to see this," the aide stammered, holding up the device with trembling hands. The screen displayed a montage of news headlines from around the world. "Russian general humiliated by British Guard." "Diplomatic incident at Buckingham Palace goes viral." "Combat veteran schooled foreign officer in discipline and professionalism." The videos had been viewed millions of times, shared across every social media platform, and picked up by news outlets from London to Moscow to Beijing. But the headlines were only the beginning of Kozlov's nightmare. The aide scrolled through the coverage, revealing layer after layer of analysis that painted the general in increasingly unflattering light. Military historians had been interviewed about the traditions and combat history of the Queen's Guard. Former soldiers had come forward to share their own experiences, serving alongside the Guards in various combat zones. Most damaging of all, several of Kozlov's own former subordinates from the Spetsnaz had given anonymous interviews praising the professionalism of British forces they had worked with in Afghanistan. The general's own words, captured in high-definition video from multiple angles, were being played back endlessly across Russian state television. His superiors in Moscow were not pleased. The phone had been ringing constantly since dawn, each call bringing worse news than the last. The British government had filed a formal diplomatic protest. The Russian ambassador was being summoned for explanations he could not provide. Most seriously, the general was being recalled to Moscow immediately for what his commanding officer had described as urgent consultations regarding conduct unbecoming. As Kozlov sat heavily in his chair, still in his underwear and confronting the magnitude of his disgrace, he began to understand the full scope of what Private Mitchell had tried to convey in those final moments at the palace. The guardsman had not merely been defending his own honor. He had been representing something much larger, something the general had been too culturally blind to recognize. The Queen's Guard were not ceremonial soldiers playing dress-up for tourists. They were active-duty combat veterans who had chosen to serve in one of the most prestigious and demanding roles in the British military. Their silence was not weakness, but discipline of the highest order. Their stillness was not passivity, but control that few soldiers anywhere in the world could match. Their ability to endure provocation without response was not evidence of broken spirits, but proof of unshakable professionalism. The general's phone buzzed with an incoming call from a number he recognized with dread. General Petrov, his immediate superior, and a man known for his volcanic temper when dealing with subordinates who had embarrassed the service. Kozlov answered on the fourth ring, his mouth dry and his hands shaking slightly. "Viktor Sergeyevich," came the gravelly voice from Moscow, using the general's formal name in a tone that conveyed barely controlled fury. "I have just finished explaining to the defense minister why one of my generals spent yesterday afternoon making a fool of himself in front of half the world. Would you care to help me understand what you were thinking?" For the first time in his adult life, General Kozlov found himself completely without words. How could he explain that he had misread the situation so completely? How could he justify his behavior to a superior who was watching the same videos that the rest of the world was sharing and commenting on? How could he admit that he had been outmaneuvered by a 19-year-old British soldier who had never raised his voice or abandoned his post? "Sir, I believed I was demonstrating the superiority of Russian military training," he managed finally, the words sounding pathetic even to his own ears. The silence on the other end of the line stretched for nearly 30 seconds before General Petrov responded. "What you demonstrated, Viktor Sergeyevich, is that you understand nothing about military professionalism, international diplomacy, or basic human dignity. Pack your bags. You will be on the next flight to Moscow, where we will discuss your future in the service, if you have a future in the service." The line went dead, leaving Kozlov staring at his phone in the growing realization that his career was likely over. 30 years of military service, a reputation built through campaigns across 3 different conflict zones, commendations and promotions earned through blood and sacrifice, all of it was crumbling because of his catastrophic misjudgment of what he had assumed were ceremonial soldiers. But the personal consequences were only part of the story. As the day progressed, the incident continued to ripple through diplomatic channels, military academies, and international relations circles. Military experts were using the confrontation as a case study in cultural awareness and professional conduct. Diplomatic training programs were incorporating it into their curricula as an example of how quickly international incidents could escalate from simple misunderstandings. Most painfully for the general, analysis pieces began appearing that highlighted exactly what he had missed about the Queen's Guard and British military culture more broadly. Academic papers were published examining the difference between discipline that came from fear and discipline that came from pride in service. Former British officers gave interviews explaining the rigorous selection process for guard duty and the combat experience required for the role. Private James Mitchell, meanwhile, had quietly returned to his duties as though nothing extraordinary had occurred. When approached by reporters seeking interviews, he politely declined, referring them to official military channels. His restraint only enhanced his reputation and further highlighted the contrast between his professionalism and the general's misconduct. The guardsman's personnel file, which had remained classified during the incident, was eventually declassified in part to provide context for the international media coverage. The details that emerged painted a picture of exactly the kind of soldier that General Kozlov had completely failed to recognize. 2 tours in Afghanistan, multiple commendations for valor under fire, specialized training in close protection and counterterrorism. A young man who had volunteered for some of the most dangerous missions in modern warfare before accepting the honor of serving as a Queen's Guard. As weeks turned into months, the general's name became synonymous with cultural arrogance and professional misconduct in military circles around the world. His forced retirement from active duty was announced quietly in a brief press release that mentioned personal reasons, but fooled no one who had followed the story. The pension he received was substantially reduced due to the circumstances of his departure from service. In his final months before leaving the military, Kozlov was assigned to a desk job reviewing procurement contracts for winter clothing. His days were spent in a windowless office in a bureaucratic building, far from anything resembling active military command. Former colleagues avoided him in the corridors. Junior officers who had once competed for his attention now barely acknowledged his presence. He had become a cautionary tale, a reminder of how quickly pride could destroy a career. The general's wife, a woman who had built her own social standing around her husband's military reputation, found herself increasingly isolated from the diplomatic community she had once dominated. Dinner invitations stopped coming. Embassy functions were attended alone. The couple's marriage, already strained by decades of military life, buckled under the additional pressure of public humiliation and social exile. On his final day in uniform, General Viktor Kozlov sat in his empty office, staring at the official photographs that documented his career. Images of him commanding troops in Chechnya, receiving decorations from senior officials, standing beside international colleagues at military conferences, all of it now overshadowed by a few hours of spectacular misjudgment outside Buckingham Palace. The irony was not lost on him that his downfall had come not from enemy action or strategic failure, but from his inability to recognize the quiet strength of soldiers who served with a different kind of courage than he had understood. Private Mitchell and his fellow guardsmen had shown him what true discipline looked like, and in doing so, they had revealed the limitations of his own character in ways that no amount of combat experience could overcome. As he walked out of the building for the last time, still carrying himself with the rigid posture that had defined his identity for 3 decades, General Kozlov finally understood what the young British soldier had been trying to teach him through silence and restraint. Real strength did not need to announce itself. True professionalism spoke through actions rather than words. And genuine military excellence was measured not by the ability to dominate others, but by the discipline to serve something larger than oneself with unwavering dignity, regardless of the cost. The lesson had come too late to save his career, but perhaps in the solitude of his disgrace, it might finally make him a better man than the one who had so catastrophically underestimated the Queen's Guard on that distant afternoon when his pride had cost him everything he had spent a lifetime building.